Think about the oldest woman in your family. Maybe she's still alive. Maybe she isn't. Either way, she probably outlived her ability to have children by decades. That shouldn't happen. Almost no other species on Earth does this. But the real answer for why she did is far stranger than medicine got better. Menopause is a biological anomaly. Most female animals stay fertile until they die. A chimpanzee, your closest living relative, keeps having offspring almost to the end of her life. So does an elephant. So does a wolf. But you carry genes that shut down reproduction decades before the body actually gives out. For a long time, scientists treated this as a glitch. A byproduct of modern medicine keeping people alive past their natural expiration date. That explanation feels obvious. It's also wrong. Here's the strange part. Menopause isn't new. It's ancient. Your female ancestors tens of thousands of years ago were already living well past their fertile years. No hospitals. No prenatal vitamins. No modern medicine at all. So why would evolution let a woman survive decades after she stopped being able to pass on her own genes? Evolution is ruthless about efficiency. It doesn't usually keep things around that don't help you reproduce. So what was she doing with all that extra time? In the 1990s, an anthropologist named Kristen Hawkes went to Tanzania to study a hunter-gatherer group called the Hadza. She wasn't looking for menopause. She was looking at food. Specifically, she was tracking who provided calories to young children after they were weaned off breast milk. You'd expect the answer to be fathers. It wasn't. The data kept pointing somewhere else. Grandmothers. Older Hadza women, well past their own reproductive years, were spending entire days digging up tubers. Tough, fibrous, energy-dense roots that small children couldn't dig up themselves and couldn't chew even if they had them. These women weren't retired. They were working harder than almost anyone else in the group, and they were funneling that labor directly into their grandchildren. Hawkes did the math. Families with an actively foraging grandmother had children who were weaned earlier, grew faster, and survived at higher rates. The grandmother wasn't a burden on the group. She was propping it up. This became known as the grandmother hypothesis. And the logic underneath it is almost uncomfortable in how simple it is. A woman only has so many years of reproductive capacity. Every pregnancy is a gamble against her own survival. Childbirth, before modern medicine, killed a staggering number of women. So, at some point in human evolutionary history, a genetic quirk emerged. Some women stopped being able to conceive relatively early. You'd think that trait would die out fast. Fewer children, fewer copies of that gene passed on. But something unexpected happened instead. The women who stopped reproducing didn't stop contributing. They redirected everything toward their existing grandchildren. And it turns out an experienced, energetic 55-year-old who already knows exactly where the best tubers are, which plants are poisonous, how to survive a drought, and how to keep a toddler alive, is worth more to her bloodline gathering food and passing down knowledge than she is trying to survive one more risky pregnancy. Her genes don't need to be inside a new baby to spread. They just need that baby, her grandchild, to survive to adulthood and have children of its own. Evolution doesn't only reward direct reproduction. It rewards anything that increases the number of your genetic descendants who survive. And it turns out an old woman with decades of accumulated survival knowledge, free from the burden of her own infants, was one of the most powerful survival tools the human species ever developed. That's not a side effect. Researchers now believe it may be one of the reasons humans live as long as we do at all. A biologist named Rebecca Sear later expanded this idea across multiple cultures, not just the Hadza, and found a consistent pattern. In many traditional societies, a living grandmother measurably improved a child's chances of survival, especially the maternal grandmother. But here's where it gets stranger. Why would this only happen in humans? Chimpanzees have grandmothers too, biologically speaking. Female chimps can become grandmothers. But they almost never do, because they rarely live long enough after their own fertility ends, and when they do, the social structure doesn't route resources toward grandchildren the way human societies do. Something about early human life, likely the shift toward difficult-to-raise, slow-developing infants with enormous, expensive brains, made grandmother labor suddenly worth an extraordinary amount. Human babies are born helpless. They stay helpless for years. Raising one takes more calories and more supervision than one mother, or even one mother and one father, can easily provide alone. Grandmothers filled the gap. Some researchers, including primatologist Sarah Blaffer Hrdy, have argued this goes even deeper than food. It's not just tubers. It's supervision, teaching, protection, and the passing down of accumulated knowledge that no single generation could rediscover on its own. A grandmother isn't just an extra set of hands. She's a walking archive. She remembers which berries made someone sick 15 years ago. She remembers how the group survived the last drought. In a world without written language, that memory was the difference between a group surviving a crisis and a group vanishing entirely. So menopause, this thing that looks on the surface like a shutdown, like decline, might actually be one of the sharpest evolutionary strategies your ancestors ever developed. Stop reproducing directly. Start reproducing indirectly through the survival of children who are already born. It's a shift from investing in quantity to investing in certainty. And this reframes something you might carry without realizing it. In modern life, aging women are frequently treated as though their value quietly expires once their fertile years end. That belief isn't biology. It isn't ancient wisdom. It's a modern cultural distortion sitting directly on top of an evolutionary story that says the exact opposite. The postmenopausal years weren't evolution's afterthought. They may have been one of its most important inventions. Your species didn't just tolerate old women. It was quite possibly built around them. Think about your own family for a second. Who taught you to cook the dish that feels like home? Who was there absorbing the chaos when your parents were stretched too thin? Who remembered the stories no one else bothered to write down? There's a real chance it wasn't a parent at all. There's a real chance it was someone who, according to strict reproductive math, should have had nothing left to give. She had everything left to give. She just wasn't giving it in the way biology usually measures. Let's go back to the Hadza for a moment, because the details matter here. Hawkes didn't just glance at who was helpful. She spent years measuring calories. She weighed tubers. She timed digging sessions. She tracked which children thrived and which ones struggled, and she cross-referenced all of it against whether a grandmother was alive, nearby, and actively foraging. This wasn't a hunch dressed up as science. It was thousands of hours of fieldwork turned into hard numbers. And the numbers kept saying the same thing. A present, active grandmother was one of the strongest predictors of a young child's survival. Stronger, in many cases, than the presence of the father. That last part tends to surprise people. You'd assume fathers as providers and protectors would be the deciding factor. But among the Hadza, a father's presence didn't move the needle on child survival nearly as much as a grandmother's presence did. Fathers often left camp for days at a time to hunt large game, which is high risk and often comes back empty-handed. Grandmothers, meanwhile, worked close to camp every single day with near total reliability. Slow and steady beat risky and occasional. It's not that fathers didn't matter. It's that grandmothers were the dependable backbone underneath everything else. Now, why does this only seem to matter so much in humans? Consider what a human infant actually requires compared to almost any other primate. A newborn chimpanzee can cling to its mother's fur within hours of birth. It can support its own weight. A human infant can do almost nothing. It cannot grip. It cannot regulate its own body temperature well. It cannot feed itself for years. And unlike most primates, human children are frequently weaned long before they're capable of finding their own food. In the wild, a young chimp who's weaned can already forage reasonably well on its own. A newly weaned human toddler cannot. That gap, the years between no longer breastfeeding and capable of independent survival, is a gap that has to be filled by somebody. Evolutionary biologists sometimes call this the weanling's dilemma. Somebody has to feed a child who can no longer nurse but still can't feed themselves. Kristen Hawkes' argument is that grandmothers became the evolutionary answer to that dilemma. And once that solution existed, it changed the entire trajectory of the species. If grandmothers could reliably keep grandchildren alive, mothers could safely have another baby sooner without waiting for the older child to become self-sufficient. Shorter intervals between births. More children surviving to adulthood. Population growth that didn't depend on any single mother's stamina alone. Some researchers now argue this single shift, older women stepping in as reliable caregivers, may have set off a chain reaction that eventually allowed for larger, more complex human social groups altogether. There's an evolutionary geneticist, Peter Ellison, whose work touches on how tightly human reproduction is tied to energy availability. His broader research supports something that fits neatly into this picture. Reproduction in humans isn't simply a biological switch. It's an energy budget. Every pregnancy, every year of breastfeeding, every additional mouth to feed draws down a finite pool of calories and care. A grandmother who no longer needs to spend her own energy on pregnancy and nursing suddenly has an enormous surplus of energy to redirect. Not toward herself, toward her daughter's children. And this is where the story stops being just about food and starts being about time. A woman past her fertile years isn't only handing over tubers. She's handing over decades of accumulated experience with almost no competing demands left on her attention. She already knows which plants heal a fever and which ones will kill you. She already knows how to read weather that's about to turn dangerous. She already knows how a group survives when the usual food sources vanish for a season. In a world with no written records, this knowledge lived only in memory, and it could only be transmitted by someone who was still alive to speak it. Sarah Blaffer Hrdy, whose research focuses heavily on cooperative breeding in early humans, has pushed this idea even further. She argues that humans are, their evolutionary core, cooperative breeders, meaning children were never raised by a mother alone, or even by two parents alone. They were raised by a network. Aunts, older siblings, and most consistently grandmothers. Hrdy suggests this cooperative structure is precisely what allowed human brains to become as large and costly as they are. A massive human brain takes an enormous number of calories to grow and maintain during childhood. That kind of investment is almost impossible for one mother to sustain solo. It becomes possible the moment you have extra caregivers absorbing part of the burden. In other words, your oversized brain, the very thing that makes you human, may exist partly because grandmothers made it affordable. Think about how strange that reframing actually is. You tend to picture human intelligence as the product of hunting, or tool use, or language. Rarely do you picture it as the product of an old woman refusing to stop working. But the math holds up. Every extra calorie a grandmother provided was a calorie a mother didn't have to scrape together alone, which meant more energy could flow toward a developing brain that needed an extraordinary amount of fuel just to finish growing. There's a wider pattern here too, documented by Rebecca Sear across dozens of traditional societies, not just the Hadza. In many of these populations, it's specifically the maternal grandmother, the mother's mother, whose presence correlates most strongly with child survival. That detail matters. It suggests something more specific than family helps family. It hints at a level of certainty. A mother always knows for certain which children are hers. A maternal grandmother is always certain those grandchildren carry her genes too. There's no ambiguity to hedge against. That certainty may be part of why the maternal line, generation after generation, became such a dependable engine of support. None of this means fathers, grandfathers, or wider communities didn't matter. Humans have always survived through overlapping layers of support. But menopause specifically, this early shutdown of fertility paired with decades of continued vigor, appears almost nowhere else in nature outside of a small handful of species, most notably some populations of orcas. And in orcas, researchers have found something eerily similar. Post-reproductive female orcas lead their pods to food during lean years, drawing on decades of accumulated memory about where prey can still be found when times get hard. Menopause, in other words, isn't a coincidence that happened to show up twice. It's a solution evolution seems to reach for whenever a species depends heavily on experience, memory, and multi-generational cooperation to survive. So when you look at an older woman today, there's a quiet biological logic sitting underneath everything modern culture tells you to see instead. Modern culture often frames aging in women as decline, as fading relevance, as a slow walk toward invisibility. But the evolutionary record tells a very different story. It says the postmenopausal decades weren't a design flaw. They were, quite possibly, one of the most important inventions your species ever produced. Not an ending. An entirely different, and arguably more essential, kind of contribution. Think about your own family for a second. Who taught you to cook the dish that feels like home? Who was there absorbing the chaos when your parents were stretched too thin? Who remembered the stories no one else bothered to write down? There's a real chance it wasn't a parent at all. There's a real chance it was someone who, according to strict reproductive math, should have had nothing left to give. She had everything left to give. She just wasn't giving it in the way biology usually measures. And the next time you flip through old photographs of an aging grandmother, or grieve one, or call one, you're not looking at someone who evolution left behind. You're looking at one of the reasons you exist at all.